How should history remember the Mongols? Today, you guys are going to be evaluating this empire that we've introduced in our last lesson, the Mongol Empire, empire of contrasts, right? Brutal conquest, but pretty chill thereafter. When we make judgments about the past, when we evaluate something, that kind of activity requires some active thought. You have to imagine what the time period would have been like in detail to kind of get the context, and then try to empathize with and understand the people who lived in it. Think about like what guided their choices. You have to look both at what they say and what they do and what makes sense for the time when you do this. So like, why did they say they did things? What did they stand to gain from doing things too, though? Usually people, especially when we're talking about empires, they have a really nice sounding ideological reason for conquest. The Romans wanted to spread civilization. I don't know, the Spaniards wanted to spread religion, thinking that they could get the natives of the Americas into heaven, in theory, right? But there's usually something else too. People usually stand to gain something pretty significant and material, right? Like nobody gets up out of bed and goes halfway across the world just to help other people, enjoy the benefits of their civilization or gain religion. Usually there's a material, like money sort of reason too. So you have to judge both of those things. Look at what people say they're doing, and then also like what they stand to gain. You have to think about the effects. What happened as a result of these actions immediately and in the long term. Immediately, when we're talking about empire building, we're probably talking about a lot of violence. In the long term, did anything good come out of that violence or not? And it's especially important in history and when you're watching the news to think really hard about words that hide a lot of suffering. We talk a lot about conquest and casualties. What does that really mean? That means a significant number of people whose lives were completely upended, who were probably harmed physically, who suffered. How do you weigh that in the balance when we're judging something about the past or the present? And it's really important too to keep in mind the context of the time. The past, as they say, is a foreign country. They do things differently then. So when we're talking about violence specifically, what were other civilizations up to? Were other civilizations doing significantly better? Or what was the violence basically in keeping with what was normal for most places at the time? So today we're going to try to do all of that all at once. Specifically, if you're in my class right now, we're about to discuss and write about whether you guys think the Mongols should be remembered for their brilliance or for being barbaric. To do this, today we're going to be gathering evidence from sources, because in history and in life, never forget, opinions unsupported by evidence, facts, do not count for anything. Second, this is a life tip as well as a history tip too. Even if you think you already know what your opinion is, it's important to always make a good faith effort to honestly gather evidence for each side, because finding out what's true is always more important than being right. And if you don't try to find the truth and instead focus on proving yourself right, then you are making yourself the biggest fool. So we're going to be looking for reasons to think that the Mongols were brilliant and reasons to think maybe barbaric is an appropriate word for them. As we go through this lesson, if you're in my class, I'd like you to open a page in your notebooks and make a T-chart so that you can jot down bullet points of evidence for both sides as we go through this video, and then later as you're going through your classwork. Specifically too, think about how you're using these words. What do you mean by brilliant? Do you mean smart? Do you mean justified over time? Do you mean they brought progress or grew civilization over the long run? That's a subjective word, so you have to be very specific about what you mean. Similarly, barbaric. How are you using that word? Do you mean crueler than what we are used to, or crueler than the standard of the time? So think about that as you're jotting down evidence. and bullet point reasons to promote one argument or the other as we go through the video. I've got one reason in each column to start you off. For brilliant, personally, I think that the tolerance of religions that the Mongols showed was spectacular, particularly for the time, particularly when you remember that in Europe, the Inquisition was going strong. On the other hand, according to a source that you're going to read in your classwork, to capture cities, sometimes they melted the fat of enemies they killed, lit it on fire, and catapulted into the cities that they were trying to conquer, which is really hard to put out. That seems, extreme, but effective too. So you make up your own opinion, put that wherever you want. Of note, in engaging this debate, in deciding whether the Mongols are brilliant or barbaric, we're actually looking at the historiography of the Mongols. We're thinking about how their history has been written and why it was written like that. We already know that most of the sources come from people that they conquered, so there's a bias that we need to keep in mind when looking at it, right? We'll also be thinking about what conclusions we can draw after looking at multiple narratives and points of view of the Mongols. So this is all doing historiography, and for me, that's what makes history super fun. I'm going to start you guys off by reading you part of a wonderful book called Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World by Jack Weatherford. Normally I assign this for homework, but in times of plague, I'm going to read it to you. So as I go through, write down anything you hear that makes you think, whoa, that's pretty brilliant, or oh, that sounds kind of barbaric. Feel free to stop the video if you need some time to catch up. So, starting to read. Fate did not hand Genghis Khan his destiny. He made it for himself. The boy who became Genghis Khan grew up in a world of excessive tribal violence, including murder, kidnapping, and enslavement. As the son in an outcast family left to die on the steppe, he probably encountered no more than a few hundred people in his entire childhood, and he received no formal education. From this harsh setting, he learned in a dreadful detail the full range of human emotion, desire, ambition, and cruelty. While still a child, he killed his older half-brother, was captured and enslaved by a rival clan, and managed to escape his captors. Under such horrific conditions, the boy showed an instinct for survival and self-preservation, but he showed little promise of the achievements he would one day make. As a child, he feared dogs and he cried easily. His younger brother was stronger than he was, and a better archer and wrestler. His half-brother bossed him around and picked on him. Yet, from these degraded circumstances of hunger, humiliation, kidnapping, and slavery, he began the long climb to power. Year by year, he gradually defeated everyone more powerful than he was, until he had conquered every tribe on the Mongolian steppe. At the age of 50, when most great conquerors had already put their fighting days behind them, Genghis Khan's spirit banner beckoned him out of his remote homeland to confront the armies of the civilized people who had harassed and enslaved the nomadic tribes for centuries. In the remaining years of his life, he followed that spirit banner to the repeated victories across the Gobi Desert and the Yellow River, into the kingdoms of China, through the Central Asian lands of the Turks and the Persians, and across the mountains of Afghanistan to the Indus River. So to summarize, that's China, the Arab Empire, modern-day India, and crossing through Afghanistan. In conquest after conquest, the Mongol army transformed warfare into an intercontinental affair, fought on multiple fronts, stretching thousands of miles. Genghis Khan's innovative fighting techniques, innovative means like new, creative. His innovative fighting techniques made the heavily armored knights of medieval Europe obsolete, replacing them with disciplined cavalry moving in coordinated units. Rather than relying on defensive fortifications, like castles, he made brilliant use of speed and surprise on the battlefield, as well as perfecting siege warfare to such a degree that he ended the era of walled cities. As a side note, siege warfare is when you surround a walled city and kind of cut them off from supplies until they eventually cave and surrender. So what that paragraph is saying is that his techniques, even though they had less stuff than like medieval European knights with all their armor and their big fancy castles, were way more effective, and actually were so effective that they made knights and those castles seem kind of silly, useless, obsolete. All right, back to the text. Genghis Khan taught his people not only to fight across incredible distances, but also to sustain their campaign over years, decades, and eventually more than 3 generations of constant fighting. In 25 years, the Mongol army subjugated more lands and people than the Romans had conquered in 400 years. Genghis Khan, together with his sons and grandsons, conquered the most densely populated civilizations of the 13th century. There are some of the cool battle techniques. Feel free to pause the slide and have a look. But the idea is that on horses, they were fast and they moved in creative, new, and very effective ways that settled civilizations couldn't really keep up with. Back to the text. Whether measured by the total number of people defeated, the sum of the countries annexed, or by the total area occupied, Genghis Khan conquered more than twice as much as any other man in history. The hooves of the Mongol warriors' horses splashed in the waters of every river and lake from the Pacific Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea. At its zenith, or at its height, the empire covered between 11 and 12 million contiguous square miles. That means it's all touching, it's all connected. In an area about the size of the African continent, and considerably larger than North America, including the United States, Canada, Mexico, Central America, and the islands of the Caribbean combined. It stretched from the snowy tundra of Siberia to the hot plains of India, from the rice paddies of Vietnam to the wheat fields of Hungary, and from Korea to the Balkans. The majority of people today live in countries conquered by the Mongols. On the modern map, Genghis Khan's conquests include 30 countries with well over 3 billion people. The most astounding aspect of this achievement is that the entire Mongol tribe under him numbered around 1 million, smaller than the workforce of some modern corporations. From this million, he recruited his army, which was comprised of, which contained no more than 100,000 warriors, a group that could comfortably fit into the larger sports stadiums of the modern era. In American terms, so if we were to take America as an example to make an analogy, the accomplishment of Genghis Khan might be understood if the United States, instead of being created by a group of educated merchants or wealthy planters, had instead been founded by one of its illiterate slaves, who by sheer force of personality, charisma, and determination liberated America from foreign rule, united the people, created an alphabet, wrote the Constitution, established universal religious freedom, invented a new system of warfare, marched an army from Canada to Brazil, and opened roads of commerce or trade in a free trade zone that stretched across continents. On every level and from every perspective, the scale and scope of Genghis Khan's accomplishments challenged the limits of imagination. As Genghis Khan's cavalry charged across the 13th century, he redrew the boundaries of the world. His architecture was not in stone, but in nations. Unsatisfied with the vast number of little kingdoms, Genghis Khan consolidated or combined smaller countries into larger ones, creating one large Russian state, the country of China, as well as basically the modern borders of Korea and India by merging smaller principalities. Genghis Khan's empire connected and merged the many civilizations around him into a new world order. At the time of his birth in 1162, the Old World, by which we mean Europe, Africa, Asia, consisted of a series of regional civilizations, each of which could claim virtually no knowledge of any civilization beyond its closest neighbor. That means that the major civilizations in the world at the time didn't really travel much, and didn't really know much about each other. No one in China had heard of Europe, and no one in Europe had heard of China. And, so far as is known, no person had made the journey from one to the other. By the time of his death in 1227, he had connected them with diplomatic and commercial contacts that still remain unbroken. As he smashed the feudal system of aristocratic privilege and birth, he built a new and unique system based on individual merit, loyalty, and achievement. He took the disjointed or disconnected and languorous trading towns along the Silk Road and organized them into history's largest free trade zone. He lowered taxes for everyone and abolished them or ended them altogether for doctors, teachers, priests, and educational institutions. He established a regular census and created the very first international postal system. His was not an empire that hoarded wealth and treasure. Instead, he widely distributed the goods acquired in combat so that they could make their way back into commercial circulation. That means he didn't keep all the stuff that he got from conquest for himself. He spread it out so that the economy could benefit more generally. He created an international law. At a time when most rulers considered themselves to be above the law, Genghis Khan insisted on laws holding rulers as equally accountable as the lowest herder. He granted religious freedom within his realms, though he demanded total loyalty from conquered subjects of all regions and religions. He insisted on the rule of law and abolished torture, but he mounted major campaigns to seek out and kill raiding bandits and terrorist assassins. He refused to hold hostages and instead instituted the novel or new practice of granting diplomatic immunity for all ambassadors and envoys, including those from hostile nations with whom he was at war. So instead of capturing people from other countries and keeping them hostage, he created a system where they could discuss diplomatically, peacefully. Genghis Khan left his empire with such a firm foundation that it continued growing for another 150 years. Then, in the centuries that followed its collapse, his descendants continued to rule a variety of smaller empires in large countries, from Russia, Turkey, and India to China and Persia. They held an eclectic or diverse assortment of titles, including Khan, Emperor, Sultan, King, Shah, Emir, and the Dalai Lama. Vestiges, or remains, of his empire remained under the rule of his descendants for 7 centuries. That's 700 years. The Mongols made no technological breakthroughs. They founded no new religions. They wrote few books or dramas and gave the world no new crops or methods of agriculture. Their own craftsmen could not weave cloth, cast metal, make pottery, or even break bread. They manufactured neither porcelain nor pottery, painted no pictures, and built no buildings. Yet, as their army conquered culture after culture, they collected and passed all of these skills from one civilization to the next. The only permanent structures Genghis Khan erected were bridges. He spanned hundreds of streams and rivers in order to make the movements of his armies and goods quicker. The Mongols deliberately, so on purpose, opened the world to a new commerce or trade, not only in goods, but also in ideas and knowledge. The Mongols brought German miners to China and Chinese doctors to Persia. The transfers ranged from the monumental to the trivial. They spread the use of carpets everywhere they went and transplanted lemons and carrots from Persia to China, as well as noodles, playing cards, and tea from China to the West. They brought a metal worker from Paris to build a fountain on the dry steppes of Mongolia, recruited an English nobleman to serve as an interpreter in their army, and took the practice of Chinese fingerprinting to Persia. They financed the building of Christian churches in China, Buddhist temples and stupas in Persia, and Muslim Quranic schools in Russia. The Mongols swept across the globe as conquerors, but also as civilization's unrivaled cultural carriers. The Mongols, who inherited Genghis Khan's empire, exercised a determined drive to move products and commodities around and to combine them in ways that produced entirely novel products, an unprecedented invention. When their highly skilled engineers from China, Persia, and Europe combined Chinese gunpowder with Muslim flamethrowers and applied European bell casting technology, they produced the cannon, an entirely new order of technological invention from which sprang the vast modern arsenal of weapons from pistols to missiles. If you want to pause here too, you can see the movement with dates of gunpowder from the east to the west, which I think is kind of cool. While each item had some significance, the larger impact came in the way the Mongols selected and combined technologies to create unusual hybrids or combinations. The Mongols displayed a devoutly and persistently internationalist zeal or enthusiasm in their political, economic, and intellectual endeavors. They sought not merely to conquer the world, but to institute a global order based on free trade, a single international law, and a universal alphabet with which to write all languages. Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan, introduced a paper currency, money, intended for use everywhere, and attempted to create primary schools for universal basic education of all children in order to make everyone literate. This was years before his time. The Mongols refined and combined calendars to create a 10,000-year calendar, more accurate than any previous one, and they sponsored the most extensive maps ever assembled. The Mongols encouraged merchants to set out by land to reach their empire, and they sent out explorers across land and sea, as far as Africa, to expand their commercial and diplomatic reach. In nearly every country touched by the Mongols, the initial destruction and shock of conquest by an unknown and barbaric tribe yielded quickly to an unprecedented rise in cultural communication, expanded trade, and improved civilization. So in other words, the author is saying that after the initial horror of conquest, there were immense benefits to the places that were conquered. In Europe, the Mongols slaughtered the aristocratic knighthood of the continent, but disappointed with the general poverty of the area compared to the Chinese and Muslim countries, turned away and did not bother to conquer the cities, loot the countries, or incorporate them into the expanding empire. In the end, Europe suffered the least, yet acquired all the advantages of contact through merchants such as the Polo family of Venice, Marco Polo, and envoys exchanged between the Mongol Khans and the popes and the kings of Europe. The new technology, knowledge, and commercial wealth created the Renaissance, in which Europe rediscovered some of its prior culture from the classical era, but more importantly, absorbed the technology for printing, firearms, the compass, and the abacus from the East. Seemingly every aspect of European life, technology, warfare, clothing, commerce, food, art, literature, and music, changed during the Renaissance as a result of the Mongol influence. In addition to new forms of fighting, new machines, and new foods, even the most mundane or day-to-day aspects of life changed, as Europeans switched to Mongol fabrics, wearing pants and jackets instead of tunics and robes, played their musical instruments with the steppe bow rather than plucking them with their fingers, and painted their pictures in a new style. The Europeans even picked up the Mongol exclamation, "Hooray!" as an enthusiastic cry of bravado and mutual encouragement. Without portraits of Genghis Khan or any Mongol record, the world was left to imagine him as it wished. No one dared to paint his image until a half-century after his death, and then each culture projected its particular image of him. The Chinese portrayed him as an avuncular, kind of fat, elderly man. with a wispy beard and empty eyes who looked more like a distracted Chinese sage than a fierce Mongol warrior. A Persian miniaturist portrayed him as a Turkish sultan seated on a throne. The Europeans pictured him as the quintessential barbarian, with a fierce visage and fixed, cruel eyes, ugly in every detail. Mongol secrecy left a daunting task to future historians, who wished to write about Genghis Khan and his empire. Biographers and historians had so little on which to base an account. They knew the chronology or the order of cities conquered and armies defeated, yet little reliable information existed regarding his origin, his character, his motivation, or his personal life. Just as the imaginative painters of various countries portrayed him differently, the scholars did too. From Korea to Armenia, they composed all manner of myths and fanciful stories about Genghis Khan's life. In the absence of reliable information, they projected their own fears and phobias onto these accounts. With the passage of centuries, scholars weighed the atrocities and the aggression committed by men such as Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Charlemagne, or Napoleon, against their accomplishments or their special mission in history. For Genghis Khan and the Mongols, however, their achievements lay forgotten, while their alleged crimes and brutality became magnified. Genghis Khan became the stereotype of the barbarian, the bloody savage, the ruthless conqueror who enjoyed destruction for its own sake. Genghis Khan, his Mongol horde, and to a large extent the Asian people in general, became undimensional characters, the symbols of all that lay beyond the civilized pale. So, that does it for Genghis Khan and the making of the modern world, and you probably got a lot of information to put in your brilliant column, because this author focuses especially on the effects of Mongol conquest. In your classwork today, you're going to be reading sources that complicate that a little bit. First, you're going to be reading about Mongol methods of conquest. How did they conquer so much territory? This is like where you're going to get some of the barbaric story, right? As a reminder from last time, archery, terror, horsemanship, and military strategy were the key methods of conquest. And as you read these sources, consider what the numbers represent when casualties or deaths are mentioned. For example, and here I'm quoting from an article called Invaders Destroying Baghdad from the New Yorker magazine about the Mongol invasion of Baghdad. Genghis Khan's armies were said to have killed 1.6 million people in the city of Herat in northwestern Afghanistan in 1222. That's 1.6 million, dispatched with arrows, clubs, and swords. Consider what that means in human terms. It has been estimated that approximately 11% of the world's population was killed either during or immediately after the Turco-Mongol invasions. If calculations are accurate, and it is a pretty big if, but still, the events would be the deadliest acts of mass killings in human history. So if you're currently in class, please pause the video here, read the first several sources about Mongol methods of conquest, and then press play again when you are ready to move on to the sources about methods of administration. Pause now. Now that you've read some videos about, read some sources about Mongol conquest, the next set of sources is going to be about how the Mongols successfully ran their empire. So again, you're going to pause the video here so that you can keep the information up on the slides as a reference while you're reading the primary sources. As a reminder, the methods of administration include tolerance of conquered cultures and religions. They didn't force their culture or religion on the conquered, but instead learned from people they conquered and adapted to them. Their strong equal system of law, which created peace and stability and made it possible for trade to exist on a wide scale. And they reestablished the Silk Roads and protected cultural diffusion. So they made trade safe and communication possible again in the huge zone that they'd conquered. And all of this led to the creation of a golden age in history, a period of peace, prosperity, and progress called the Pax Mongolica. So go ahead and pause the video here and read those sources.